Hello, and welcome back to Introduction to Genetics and Evolution. In today's lectures, I'd like to take a little foray into a very exciting sub-area of evolutionary biology, and that's the intersection between evolutionary biology and the study of animal behavior. In this first lecture, we'll look at optimality and adaptive feeding behavior. But first, let's talk a little bit more broadly about animal behavior. Animal behavior is a very, very active research area, and particularly studying animal behavior in an evolutionary context. You can study animal behavior from many different approaches. You can look at hormonal basis for animal behavior, you can look at neural basis for animal behavior, but what we want to look at now, rather than proximate causes, we want to look at the ultimate reason for why animals behave the way that they do. Now, behavior, as I mentioned, integrates with these many different aspects of biology, such as physiology or hormones and nerves, genetics, ecology, and fundamentally evolution. Now, some areas where evolutionary thinking is applied to the study of animal behavior is in the context of survival or avoiding predation. Obviously, very important for passing on your genes is that you don't get killed early. Feeding or foraging behavior. It's obvious this is what's happening at the other end of this. Choosing where to live, communicating, reproductive behavior, sexual selection. This one we'll talk about in a different context much later on, but not here in these videos. Parental care and social behavior. So we'll dabble into a couple of these in the videos that you have here. The ones in this particular video that we'll talk about are looking at optimality theory, or specifically how you can get the maximal effect for the minimal cost, which is what we would infer that natural selection would push species to ultimately be able to do. And we'll look at applying optimality theory to the study of feeding behavior and why feeding behavior is often adaptive. Now, as you know, the evidence for natural selection abounds across species. So let's look at the example of the Eurasian oyster catcher. Now, this species feeds on mussels, so not mussels like this, but mussels like the small clams that you have over here. Now, there's an optimal size of mussel for this bird to pursue. If a mussel is too small, they're not going to get enough nourishment. It's not worth it for them to spend the energy to open something that's going to give them almost no energy. If it's too large, it becomes extremely hard to open, at which point they'll expend tons of energy and may never get any nutrients out of it as well. So there should be some optimal intermediate size mussel that these oyster catchers would be selecting. And that would be, in principle, selected by natural selection. Now, people ran a bunch of models and they suggested that oyster catchers should pick 50 millimeter size mussel. That was the prediction. From these initial models, they looked for this, and in fact, there was not a good fit of the models to the data. That in fact, these oyster catchers were picking smaller mussels. So they refined the mussels, and they predicted with this refinement that the oyster catchers should pick 30 to 45 millimeter mussels because the larger ones are covered with barnacles, and that may make them harder to open. Now, in fact, the birds do prefer 30 to 45 millimeter mussels, so with this revision of the model fits the data. This should be causing you a little bit of concern when somebody just manipulates a model to make it fit the data, right? Well, there is this view that selection is everywhere, right? That structures and behaviors are optimally designed by natural selection for their function. And whenever we see something as non-optimal, we infer a trade-off or some sort of compromise among competing demands. Now, this is a little bit of a risky thing because basically you're making it so every possible observation will eventually fit your model. Now, Gould and Lewontin criticized this and referred to this as the adaptationist program. They suggested that many researchers were doing this. They were interpreting data by assuming the near omnipotence of natural selection in forging organic design and fashioning the best among possible worlds. Now, this is often referred to as adaptive storytelling by people who don't like it. That, we see something and we just make up an adaptive story until it seems to fit and then say, oh, that must have been it. Yeah, that's it. That's not good science. And unfortunately, this kind of thing has happened for a very long time. Overinterpretation goes back over 100 years. In fact, if you look back before 1909, Spencer asked Galton to look at his fingerprint. And Galton said he didn't know the functions of these patterns, And many people had studied this, dissecting the fingers of unborn children, trying to study their prints, things like that. Now, Spencer suggested, well, the ridges obviously, there's an important word here, obviously, function to protect the sweat glands in the valleys. Sounds like that makes sense. Problem is, the glands are actually in the ridges themselves, so actually it doesn't make sense at all. Now, science has been referred to by Thomas Henry Huxley as the organized common sense where many a beautiful theory was killed by an ugly fact. In fact, despite the use of optimality theory, and optimality theory is actually a good thing when applied properly, there are many traits and behaviors out there that are not perfectly adapted. Now, there are many reasons why traits or behaviors may not be perfectly adapted as we see them now in the wild. Well, one possibility is that there's been a failure for the appropriate mutations to occur. That if the mutation for making it just that much better never happened, then it's stuck where it is, right? You could have single genes that cause multiple phenotypic effects. This is referred to as pleiotropy, where, for example, an allele may be good for one trait but bad for a different trait, such that there's this sort of trade-off going on. There is the possibility that ultimately the trait will be perfectly adapted, but there hasn't been sufficient time for selection to operate, or the environment keeps changing, and it's this moving target that makes it very hard for a trait to be optimally adapted for any particular. There are many, many other reasons. This is just a subset of those. But very importantly, optimality predictions should be tested and judged, not just presumed. Now, optimality, when I use this term, is the assumption that by knowing exactly how natural selection is acting on this trait, we should be able to predict exactly what the trait should look like. Now, let me give you an example where there was some misunderstanding again in terms of understanding a trait. This is the example of the oxpecker. So this is a bird that you often see on top of an ox, for example. They live on large mammals. They thought to feed somewhat on ticks, at least. And the dogma that was repeated for many, many years is it was mutually beneficial for the oxpecker bird and the ox to be associated, because the bird was picking off these ticks that are bad for the animal, and so the mammal just leaves them there. Unfortunately, there were no good tests of this until around 2000. And what happened then is people started exploring whether the cattle that had oxpeckers had more or less ticks than cattle without oxpeckers. Now, if the oxpeckers are picking off the ticks, then you would assume that cattle that have the oxpecker bird should have fewer ticks, right? Well, in fact, tests showed there was no significant reduction in tick load when you had oxpeckers. So they tested this multiple times, and there was no significant reduction. And in fact, further tests showed that these oxpeckers were actually enlarging open wounds and drinking the blood from the ox. That's not good. That's not mutualistic at all. That's something very much to the benefit of the bird, but to the detriment of the large mammal. Now, the question you might want to ask is, so why do the cattle tolerate these birds hanging on them? They're opening their wounds. Well, I asked my class this back in 2012, and here's a set of some of the responses. On the negative side, somebody suggested that the hosts don't actually tolerate the oxpeckers, but they just are not able to get them off. That is a possibility. There's a neutral side that maybe, that's not actually that big a deal to the cattle. So it's kind of like when a fly is buzzing in my face, and after a while I just let it pester me because it won't go away. This suggests that maybe the oxpecker's effect on the cattle is fairly small, even though they're getting potentially nutrients themselves. There's the mutual advantage side that somehow they're strengthening the cattle's immunity, possibly by increasing antibodies to fight antigens. That would definitely be an adaptationist explanation. And there were some crazy out there explanations people suggested, like maybe they like the company or the oxpeckers generate mini force fields. That's probably not it. When we look at the research results for why this was the case, so looking at the research results for why the hosts tolerate these, it turns out, in fact, that some of these hosts try to get them off, but are unable to do so, just like the one student had suggested in the previous slide. That in the case of rhinos, they tried quite hard, but were only able to get them off half the time when they were at wounds. So this figure down here shows attempts to remove the oxpecker from at wounds, so successful versus unsuccessful. It's only about half of them were successful at getting them off the wounds. In contrast, when they're on the ears, they're able to flick them off fairly easily, or at other places on their body, they were able to flick them off easily. So it is not a mutualistic thing as was previously assumed, even though that was the adaptationist explanation. So let's look at applying optimality theory to studying adaptive feeding behavior, but let's try to be careful not to be overly adaptation. So what considerations go into optimal feeding? Well, if you want to feed, and again, you want to do it as efficiently as possible, what you want to do is you want to maximize energy while minimizing consumption of energy and time, right? So high energy per low unit of time is the best. So on the plus side, you're getting calories from food. That's your energy. On the minus side, you're expending energy to get the food. So energy may be involved in searching, handling, eating, or digesting. And on the minus, there's also time involved in getting food, which also involves, of course, burning more energy, but it's time involved in searching, handling, digesting. So if we were to put together a very simple formula for optimal foraging, we want to maximize this quantity. We want to maximize calories obtained from food minus calories expended getting food divided by time to get and eat. Okay, so again, we want the prey with the highest caloric content. We want to spend the minimal energy and time getting this prey. So this is the idea behind it. So let's look at this in the context of whelk-eating crows, another set of birds eating shelled animals. In this case, these are crows in British Columbia that pick up whelks on average about 4 centimeters long, rarely less than that. They fly up into the air with these whelks, and they drop them. Now they fly almost exactly 5 meters and then drop them to try to shatter the shell and get the snail meat outside. And sometimes it takes a couple of flights to do it. Is this adaptive? Well, there's a couple of different things these could do, right? They could pick different size whelks. They could fly different heights. They could fly more times. So let's look and see how this might be adaptive. Let's break it up into parameters. First, let's look at the height of drop. Obviously, it takes energy to fly high, so you want to minimize the energy you're taking for flying high. But you want a high probability that shell will break. You don't want to have to fly 40 times. You want to fly like once or twice and be able to break it. So people looked at this in the context of the underlying physics, and it turns out, in fact, 5 meters height is optimal for the size for that size shell to shatter. So you can look here on the x-axis, the height in meters. So this is from 0 to 15 feet or 15 meters in the air. On the y-axis is number of drops required to break the whelk shell. And you note when you're at 5 meters, you're pretty much at a level point there where it doesn't seem like if you go much higher, you have a much higher probability of breaking the whelk shell. So that's at a very optimal point. There's a very little increase in probability of shell breaking if you go any higher. So that does seem to be adaptive. What about the size of whelk? Couldn't they have picked maybe a smaller whelk? Why didn't they pick the smaller whelk? Well, they experimentally tried 3 sizes. In this case, the one they picked is referred to as large. These are the 4 centimeter whelks. And they found that the whelk would need to, the bird, not the whelk. The bird would need to fly higher and or drop more times to break the smaller shell. So again, on the x-axis here, we show the height of drop. On the y-axis, we show the number of drops needed per whelk. So for the large one, again, this is what they ended up choosing. If they chose a smaller whelk, a medium-sized one, they would have to drop it, twice that many times, and even more if they chose a very small whelk. So again, it seems like they did choose adaptive. Now, a question a lot of people like to ask is, do we see optimal feeding in humans? Well, there is the case of spices, and spices have been suggested as a place where humans may actually some sort of optimal. Now, the caloric content in them is typically very low. So why do we like spicy food? Why do you like garlic? Maybe you don't like garlic. Well, one possibility is it's just random or some correlated response to smell or taste that's unrelated to the actual garlic itself. The other possibility is that there's an antimicrobial property associated with some of the spices we use. In fact, many spices are known to have very strong antimicrobial properties. Cinnamon, cloves, and mustard have strong antimicrobial effectiveness. Some of the others have medium antimicrobial effectiveness, like allspice, cumin, oregano, etc. And some inhibit very specific things, like garlic, for example, as I mentioned, inhibits salmonella, E. coli, staph, bacillus. Cloves inhibit aspergillus, and things like that. So let me ask you to generate a prediction in video quiz here. If spices are used because they're antimicrobial, and given what you might guess about what countries have particular environments that are warm or moist and thus more likely to have a lot of microbes, if you surveyed the following countries, India, Hungary, and Norway, which would you expect to use the most spices in their cuisine, and specifically the most spices with antimicrobial properties? Well, that was a pretty easy question, I think. The expectation is that more antimicrobials are needed in environments that will favor the growth of microbes. So places where it's warm and moist will favor the growth of microbes. So if we look at these three countries, India, Hungary, and Norway, it's a no-brainer. The wettest place and the hottest place is India. So this is a place where more antimicrobials would be needed. Hungary is kind of intermediate, and Norway really is not particularly wet, and, well, it's somewhat wet, but very much not hot overall. If we look at the spices used, what we see here is, this is a list of spices on the x-axis, on y-axis, percent of recipes that have any of those spices. Tons of spices are used in India, somewhat in Hungary, and not so much in Norway. Way more spices are used in India than the other two. Now, importantly, with the red arrows, I designated the use of garlic and onions in particular. Now, remember I mentioned that garlic had very specific antimicrobial properties. Let me show you the antimicrobial effectiveness of a suite of spices. Here are garlic and onions. They show almost complete inhibition of bacteria. So these are very, very effective antimicrobials. In contrast, something like celery seed is not particularly effective at all. So you see here, garlic and onion are almost completely effective. Allspice and oregano also very highly effective. Thyme, etc., starting to show slightly weaker inhibition of bacterial growth. So that's pretty cool. Now, in this case, we didn't really consider alternatives. So what are some of the alternative explanations that should be considered? One is that there actually are micronutrients being provided by these spices. It's a possibility. Another is that spices are used to disguise the smell of spoiled food. And the last is maybe they're just used where they grow. That maybe all these things grow in India and they don't grow in Norway or Hungary so much. Well, these have been investigated. Now, in terms of the micronutrients, that doesn't really explain the correlation with temperature. Why is it that people in this particular temperature need these micronutrients more than others? In terms of this disguising the smell of spoiled food, that actually doesn't really make sense evolutionarily because it's not to your advantage to consume spoiled food. If anything, it can be to your disadvantage. And in terms of being used where they grow, there is actually a very weak correlation between where they grow and where they're used, but that doesn't really explain the overall pattern. For example, pepper is one of the most widely used, and it grows in a very, very small fraction of the places. So it doesn't seem like that's explaining it. Now, just extrapolating from this into the importance of communication. Communication is critical for the context of finding food for a lot of species, not just for making food available to us. A classic case for this is that of honeybee dances. This was elegantly described by Nobel laureate Karl von Frisch. He showed that scout bees actually will come back to the hive and can actually give hive mates detailed information about the location of food by way of how they do their little dances. Now, I won't try to explain this dance to you, but I'll refer you to a YouTube link. This is also available online, but you should definitely watch this. It's very cool, this means of communicating where food is. So we've been looking at this all in the context of adaptive feeding behavior, but as you see with the examples I'm talking about here in the context of bees, communication is sometimes very important as well. We'll come back to that in the next video. Thank you. Hello, and welcome back to Introduction to Genetics and Evolution. In the previous video, we talked about the adaptationist program and how people erroneously overinterpret things to be products of natural selection. From that, we went into optimality theory, which is the assumption that you are trying to maximize productivity for the minimal cost, and we applied that to feeding behavior. What I'd like to look at now are two other kinds of behaviors, communication and parental care. Now, what is communication? Well, we have an intrinsic idea of what communication is, but let's break it up a little bit. Now, communication is ultimately coming from a signal sent from one individual to another with the effect of altering a recipient's behavior in some way. That's when you know a communication has actually happened, that you actually alter the recipient's behavior. So, an example might be in the context of foraging. I mentioned the honeybee dances last time. So the bee comes back to the hive, he does the little dance, and then everybody goes to the place where she tells them that there was food. We see this in the context of alarm calls that, for example, there are these ground squirrels that will scream out when a predator is approaching, allowing others to run away. We definitely see this, of course, in the context of sexual behaviors, and you can anticipate what the intended outcome of that would be. And of course, there are threat displays, as this one, where you want to make, your threat go away. Now, one common example that people talk about is that of the stotting behavior observed in Thompson's gazelles. This is a very interesting one because in this case, the communication is thought to be interspecific or between species. It's almost like a communication from the prey to the predator. That if the gazelle, as depicted in this one who's jumping here in the air, sees a predator, it starts this very high jump. And this stotting behavior is what this jumping is called, is thought to be communicating to the predator, hey, I see you, it's not worth it for you to run after me because I run faster already and I see you're there. So in this sense, it's advantageous to both the prey and the predator. Because what could happen is, yes, the cat could run after the gazelle, but if indeed the gazelle has actually seen the cat, and if indeed the gazelle does run much faster, there's kind of no point to it. They're both just going to waste their energy for no particular purpose. So this is a very interesting proposed example of this. Now again, there's this whole range of possible things, but particularly thinking about something like this gazelle stotting, what about deception? What would happen if, for example, those gazelles just did that all the time? So, wouldn't it ever come out that this is just what they do and they're not actually trying to signal they're not actually signaling to a predator that they see? Well, honest signaling is something that is actually selected for. And I'll explain why. Now, most signals tend to benefit the signaler and in that regard tend to benefit the signaler's genes. But the question is, do some animals signal in a way to manipulate others? Like, for example, could you give a warning call of predators so others will flee while you get food? There are some birds that will actually do this. They'll do an alarm call and then go after a prey, basically making others get out of the way. It's a little bit freaky. Or they'll fool opponents into thinking you're actually stronger than you really are. So these will be cases of dishonest signals. Now, when can this actually happen? Well, dishonest signals are actually very difficult to maintain because selection will ignore favoring them. Right? That those individuals who ignore the signal will have higher fitness than those individuals who respond to the signal in the intended way. Let me say that again. Those individuals who ignore the signal will have higher fitness than those individuals who respond to the signal in the intended way. So in this regard, ignoring will spread, and eventually the signal elicits no further response, at which point you no longer have communication. So there are some conditions where dishonest signals can persist. And those two conditions are if, first, the cost for not responding is very high, that you have to respond because if you mess up, the cost is very, very high, and if the dishonest signal is rare relative to the honest signal. Let me give you a couple of examples. So here's a case of what we refer to as fatal attraction in fireflies. So first let me introduce friendly Photinus. This is standard little firefly. The males flash to find females, the females flash back, and you can anticipate what happens after that. Well, there's another species that looks kind of similar. We'll call it less friendly Photurus. Well, it flashes just like Photinus females. Now, since it flashes like Photinus females, the Photinus males are actually attracted. And what happens to them? Well, unfortunately, the Photinus males actually get eaten by the Photurus female. So this is a very unfortunate outcome for the Photinus males. It's good for the Photurus ones. Now, you may wonder, why is it the Photinus males don't just ignore the flash? Well, if they ignore the flash, and the flash is identical to their own females, they will never mate. The other thing is that Photurus tends to be less common than Photinus. So most of the time when they respond, the right thing is happening. Just every now and then, they get eaten. Let me show you, this was an example where you're exploiting a mating signal to feed. Now, let me show you a case of the opposite. Here's exploiting a feeding preference to elicit mating. So here's the water mite Pneumania papillator. I apologize if I mispronounced that. And what it does is it sits there and it eats passing crustaceans. So it sits upright. It senses vibrations in the water from passing animals. So it might be a little Daphnia or something like that. And when it detects the prey, it jumps down on it and it eats it. What's interesting that's happened, so this is a female maybe sitting there. What's happened is the males actually vibrate their legs, mimicking the exact vibrations that the prey do. What happens then is the females will orient towards the males and grab at them. And when the females do this, the males very quickly fertilize the eggs. So this is a very odd situation where the males are exploiting a feeding behavior by the females to come in and fertilize her eggs and get close in that sense. So this sounds pretty cool, but is this a case of the adaptive storytelling that we talked about before? Well, if this mating behavior evolved in response to a pre-existing feeding behavior, there's a prediction we can generate. Do we predict that we should see a greater response? Should we see greater response to males by females that are hungry or by females that are full? Well, the answer is pretty simple. If it's acting in response to this feeding preference, we expect hungry females to be more likely to mate with males in this way. This is exactly what has been observed. When people have done studies of this, they in fact found that hungry females were much more likely to act in response to the males and therefore have their eggs fertilized in response to this deceptive signal. Let me show you another deceptive signal, not in the context of feeding this time. Here's the European common cuckoo. Now we tend to think of cuckoos as the things in these cute clocks, but in fact they're not very nice birds. These are referred to as brood parasites. What they do is they don't actually raise their own young. Instead, the cuckoo mom will find a nest of some other species of bird. She will replace some of the host's eggs with her own. So she will roll out a couple of the host's eggs, out of the nest and down onto the ground, put in some of her own eggs. And then what happens, the cuckoo chicks actually hatch earlier, and these cuckoo chicks also often push the host's remaining eggs out of the nest. And then the cuckoo sits there as this huge bird like this guy here, demanding food, and the host comes in and provides it. So there is some sort of dishonest signal here for parental care. Now, a lot of people look at this and they say, they look at that bird there in the picture and they say, how on earth can that mom think that was one of her chicks? Or are the hosts just stupid? The answer is no. This was studied by this fellow here, Neil Davies. So there are two factors that stimulate host birds to feed the cuckoo parasite. First is large size. Large size stimulates that behavior. And these cuckoos are very large in size. They're typically much larger than the hosts. The other thing is, if we look, the begging call rate matches that of the real offspring very well. So these show some sonograms of a reed warbler, which might be one of the hosts for a cuckoo, and this shows the cuckoo chick. And you see, actually, these sonograms match fairly closely. Now, this was actually studied using recorded calls, and often they actually could not distinguish the calls that well of their offspring from the cuckoo offspring. Now, it still seems like the cuckoo that the warblers or the host should be able to figure this out. And maybe they can, but really their options are more limited than it may seem. There's a couple of reasons. Well, first, some warblers will actually try to push the cuckoo eggs out, but will accidentally push their own out at the same time. That's obviously to everybody's disadvantage. Sometimes they'll just abandon the nest altogether, but when they do that, their offspring die too. So that's again at a disadvantage. And there's an added disadvantage. This is a newer hypothesis, and that is the mafia hypothesis, that the cuckoo mom will attack nests of birds that eject her eggs. And again, there's some evidence in support of this. The cuckoo mom is watching off on the side, and if you misbehave, she comes in and she lets your offspring have it. So these poor birds, they're under a lot of pressure. Now, we've talked about these signals that are intended for particular recipients, but sometimes what will happen is signals will be intercepted by unintended recipients and then misused. Now, what we see in this case is that in this particular example here, there's predators and parasitoids that home in on signals from the prey. Okay, so here we have an Ormia parasitoid fly. So this little fly that's sitting here on the cricket is an Ormia parasitoid fly. It is tuned into the calling song of these male crickets in Hawaii. And what will happen is, they'll hear the song, they'll come over onto the male, and they'll force their eggs inside the male. So eventually, the male will die as the Ormia larva comes out, as you can see here in this picture below. Now they have very precise eardrums in these Ormia that allow perfect localization of these male crickets. And they're only observed in female Ormia, not male Ormia. So it's very much for the purpose of sticking these eggs inside these male crickets. So this is a bad deal for the crickets. Now, interestingly, in this particular example, the crickets have responded evolutionarily. So between 1991 and 2001, there was a major drop in the cricket population due to these nasty parasitoid Ormia flies. But then this new mutation arose on the X chromosome that made mute male crickets. That basically they chirp very quietly. Now in doing that, the Ormia can't home in on them. So what we've seen now is the cricket population has rebounded, but nearly all the males are mute. So we might expect here, this shows 4 possible things, that if the flies are absent, then it's best to have these noisy normal wings, right? Because then you can attract a lot of mates, right? Because you want to call as loud as you can to call mates in. If flies are present, you're going to die, like this dead cricket here. So that would not be good. If you have a mute male, if he's competing with noisy ones, he doesn't do so well in terms of mating, right? If the flies are absent. But if the flies are present, he's going to get some of the mates because nobody's really competing. The ones who sing loudly are all killed off by the Ormia, but he can actually get a couple of these mates. So there's actually an advantage to being mute only in populations where the flies are present, not in populations where the flies are absent. So that's a very, very cool example of an evolutionary response to an intercepted signal by a parasitoid. So last topic I wanted to cover with you today is parental care. And again, I'll talk about this only very briefly. There are many levels of parental care out there. There's the absolutely no parental care, and that's investment in your offspring ends with indiscriminate release of gametes. And this is again what happens with a lot of marine invertebrates. They just spew out their gametes, and that's it. They never do anything else for their offspring. There are some weak examples of parental care, such as, for example, the strategic laying of eggs in optimal spots, and you see this in fruit flies. And of course, there's true parental care, where you have significant investment, where you have birds, for example, provisioning their young, dogs, most humans, things like that. Now, many of you realize that, especially when we're looking at mammals and birds and things like that, it's females that usually do most of the parental care. Now the question is why? Why is it the females are more likely to provide food? Why is it females are more likely to be hanging around defending the kids? Well, there are several proposed reasons for this. First is that paternity certainty is often lower than maternity certainty. There's never any doubt who the mom is for the kids because the kids come out of the mom. For the dad, though, there's often this some bit of doubt that maybe they're spending a lot of energy caring for kids that maybe aren't theirs because there's not this direct association with their role. Males can also sneak off very briefly to mate a lot in a very short period of time. They could sneak off for one evening and have multiple matings that all result in offspring. Don't think of this in the human sense. It's very disturbing if you think of this in the human sense. But think of it as like a bird, for example. So you could sneak off for one night and have lots more kids. So for its overall fitness, it could go up quite a bit by that sneaking off. And again, females may invest more in the eggs themselves, so it may be worth more for them to continue to invest and not let that original investment just go to pot. Now, there are some exceptions to the rule that help us interpret these. These exceptions include things like the giant male water bug, one species of which is shown over here. This is an interesting case. What happens with these water bugs is the eggs are put onto the back. And it's absolutely essential for the males to take care of these eggs. So what they'll do is they'll go up maybe to the surface of the water and get them just a little bit of air to absorb a little bit more oxygen. Or they'll do little push-ups underwater to allow the water to flow over them to get them enough oxygen to get into the eggs so that the hatchlings will make it. And it's very important because if they abandon the eggs don't make it. If they take care of the eggs, most of them do make it. So this is something that's absolutely essential to the survival of these offspring. Another one that you may have heard of are these pipefish, and they're relatives of seahorses. They have pouches where the males will, again, take care of the young fish. They will go into this pouch, and they actually have a direct connection, so they're actually receiving nutrients directly from dad in this case. So these are dramatic exceptions to these generalizations about females doing all the parental care. Now, you may wonder, Why are there these exceptions to the rules? Well, there are a couple of hypotheses for this. One is that there is actually a lack of trade-off between mate attraction and parental care. There's some indication that that is true. So, for example, with the water bugs, there's some indication that females are disproportionately attracted to males that have these eggs on their back. So there's actually a mating advantage to taking care of the kids. So that's definitely a plus. There's other examples too. So these stickleback fish, as shown here, they'll actually build these fancy nests and where they take care of offspring. And these nests, again, are attractive to females. So, females will come there and they can then be mated to by the male. So there's not this trade-off. It's not that, oh, if the male had gone off on his own, he'd actually have better mating success. In fact, the mating success may be equivalent or even better associated with doing this paternal care. The other possibility is the cost for care may be disproportionately great for females. So for example, the water bugs, the females have already invested very heavily in producing all these eggs. If they then had to go around carrying them and shaking them and doing all this stuff, it's possible they just wouldn't make it. It's possible they just wouldn't survive. So in that sense, there had to be some sort of division of labor so that the species could continue in some level. Again, these exceptions are essentially helping reinforce the overall principles. Now this is obviously just a tiny, tiny little taste of the interesting kinds of things that can be studied in the context of parental care or paternal care even in particular. But more broadly, again, coming back to what I said in the last video, the study of animal behavior is really, really exciting. It ties into many areas of biology, and especially evolutionary biology, which is the focus of our class. And we talked in the previous video about optimality and being careful in the context of adaptation as thinking, but seeing how you could actually maximize gains for minimal effort and expenditures. We looked at adaptive feeding behaviors examples. We looked at various forms of communication, parental care. But again, there's a whole spectrum out there. And in fact, even here in Coursera, there is another animal behavior class. So if you're interested, I would encourage you to go check it out. Thank you for your time. I hope you enjoyed this.